Good day, everyone. I'm Ethan, moderator for this webinar. Welcome everyone for today's webinar. Hospital medical staff, bylaws, problems and solutions. Update now. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Elizabeth Snelson. Elizabeth Snelson helps medical staff across the country with medical staff bylaws and works for medical societies on medical staff issues. A frequent speaker on medical staff legal issues. Ms. Snelson presents as medical staff leadership retreats and in progress sponsored by state medical staff services, associations, and medical societies. She is past president of the American Society of Medical Association Council, vice president of the ABS Physical. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for your patience. So I will be talking twice as fast as I usually do, which is already fast. But you'll see in the slides that there's quite a bit of information available to you here, and of course I'd welcome your questions even after the webinar concludes. So we're talking about hospital medical staff bylaws and solutions and things that you should pay attention to now in order to update your bylaws. When looking at medical staff bylaws, so what you should know is that your hospital medical staff bylaws have a lot of compliance responsibilities. If your hospital is accredited by or seeking accreditation from the Joint Commission, then there are a number of medical staff bylaws standards that must be met. Even if you're not seeking Joint Commission accreditation, it's important to know what the Joint Commission expects. Every state has got a different approach to medical staff law and medical staff requirements. In addition to those basic compliance issues, it's important to keep your medical staff bylaws in tune with what the medical staff is doing now. I'll be using examples throughout the webinar that come from the Massachusetts Medical Society Model Medical Staff Bylaws. The medical staff bylaws have to be accepted by the medical staff and by the hospital board of each individual hospital, and each individual medical staff is different. Another important issue to address right at the jump is in your bylaws, make sure that you're not setting yourselves up for inconsistencies among hospital medical staff documents. The bylaws are subject to amendment. Now, under Joint Commission standards, it gets a little complicated. Here's an amendment process that lays that both the committee process and the medical staff process. It's important that the bylaws have a definition section. So, for example, here's a definition of the term investigation. Another major issue for medical staff bylaws is membership. Membership has categories, typically active. So here's an example for active category. Voting rights, it's important to specify those. Credentialing is a key part of the medical staff responsibilities and needs to be delineated clearly in the medical staff bylaws. For example, one example that comes up in the credentialing area is what goes in the file, where it goes, who's responsible for controlling the credentials file. Privileges, major area for medical staff bylaws. Don't forget to provide for change by resigning privileges or might be resigning them permanently. So peer review is the big job of the medical staff. So here's an example from the Massachusetts model on corrective action. That's necessary under federal law in order to win the immunity that's available under the Healthcare Quality Improvement Act. It's important under state law, which may well set out requirements for hearings when any corrective action is going to affect a medical staff member's practice. Here's, in these next three slides, are what is required for the hearing process to meet the standards of the federal law. In those three slides are the requirements for federal law compliance for hearings. It's important to go into certain detail on issues like how there's going to be a hearing officer. In addition to all the corrective action requirements, there's so many other things that the medical staff does in addition to peer review. Unification and disunification, again, a fairly recent requirement under conditions of participation. Committees can be many or few. It depends upon the sophistication of your medical staff and its size. A bylaws committee can really be helpful, but only the executive committee is required by the Joint Commission. Medical staffs have a health committee as we're dealing more and more with issues of physician health because physicians get sick Who knew? Especially with burnout, and we also saw it with COVID. Medical staff management is necessary. The medical staff needs to be managed, and there's so many different ways to approach it. Has provisions for the bylaws to, sorry, jump the gun, to clearly identify what kind of supports are necessary for the medical staff to be managed professionally. Here, for example, is a sample language that talks about how information needs to be kept confidential. I also recommend, everybody hates parliamentary authority, but it really can be helpful when you're up against a particular issue. I mentioned don't put an age in for your requirements for membership. Don't do it. Don't do it. Focusing on core competency and having that wellness committee, that health committee, the Joint Commission wants you to do it. Conflict of interest, I've mentioned a couple of times. The medical staff is a sophisticated organization, and like any sophisticated organization, especially one that's judging others through peer review, right, needs to have conflict of interest provisions. And there's a good one from the Massachusetts model. Be aware that the hospital has a compliance code that deals with a lot of these issues. For the hospital, the medical staff needs to have its own approach to many of those issues, is to make sure that the medical staff is involved in coordinating compliance code issues from the hospital side and the medical staff side. Make sure there's a code of conduct in your bylaws. The Joint Commission calls for it. Same with, again, employment of physicians. And so, again, here's a best practice on dealing with the issues of employed or contracted members vis-a-vis the medical staff bylaws. I recommend dispute resolution be addressed right in the bylaws. Make sure, though, that what isn't part of dispute resolution is peer review. We've got processes. With that, I'll leave you with some resources. With that, if there's any questions pending, I'll take them. Otherwise, thanks for your attendance. I'd like to, again, thanks everyone for your attendance and your participation. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That does conclude the session for today. Thank you everyone for participating. You all may disconnect now. You all have a great day ahead. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.